Hello and welcome to Viva, where I have been making videos and posting them on YouTube about a number of things. This particular video I'm making is part 2 on the discernment of spirits. Now, really, it's sort of a part 3. I mean, maybe it's part 2 if you count the video on the first principle and foundation as the part 0. And I think that that's a good way to look at it. Because the first principle and foundation is so foundational, it's probably good to do a quick repasso or a review to kind of sum up some of the things that were said about the first principle and foundation in an earlier video. First, it's that God made us for a purpose, right? God did not simply make us and then step back and say, who knows what will happen? Who cares what will happen? Maybe even gave us some laws and said, don't break these laws over here. And for those who do a good job of not breaking those laws, I'll go ahead and gather you guys up, bring you into heaven. And everybody else, well, they didn't really want to be in heaven anyway, so who cares? This is not how this works. God has in mind a purpose for you, and that purpose really means everything. God commands us not only to avoid evil and do good, but that we should always do the best option available to us. This is where the Jesuits get the phrase ad maiorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God. Of all the things that you could pick the options that are the greatest, that glorify God the most, that most lead to our salvation through these things that God has put in our life. And that we should use the things of this world to the extent that they help us achieve the end for which we were created, So some things are good for us to use a little bit. Some things are good for us to use a lot. Some things are not good for us to use at all right now, but maybe later. Some things are always bad. Don't use them at all, etc. And according to the first principle and foundation, a major piece of knowing what God wants you to do and to be able to fulfill that desire for God for you in your life is to be indifferent to the things of this world, so that God can call you to things that might not immediately appeal to you. You have to be indifferent to the things of this world, to not prefer one thing over another. Okay, and in the previous video, which I called a primer on the discernment of spirits, I suppose if there's one overarching point that you want to understand from that other video, the primer on the discernment of spirits is that you cannot always trust your feelings. You cannot always just say, I feel comfort, I feel gratified, therefore that must be somehow feelings from God. That's just not true, right? It's just not true. Feeling comfort, feeling gratification is not always from the good spirit. And then, of course, feeling discomfort, feeling dissatisfied is not always from the evil spirit, right? There are spirits and they have agendas, right? So the good spirit wants you to be who God made you to be. The evil spirit wants to somehow get you off track. And those agendas mean that they both have the ability to pull you or push you in a certain direction. Not completely, right? You have the ability to answer those feelings in a certain way, but that those feelings are not in and of themselves immediately obvious where they are coming from. If you can figure out where the feelings are coming from, that's half the battle right there. You can then accept those feelings from the good spirit and respond to them appropriately. Or if they're coming from the evil spirit, you can reject them. And we'll get into a whole lot more of how to do all that. But suffice it to say, it's not okay to just trust your feelings and say good feelings must be coming from the good spirit. That's just not true. And bad feelings are not always from the evil spirit. A few other things I want to say too before we really get started. What we're doing here is a little bit different from what I've seen before, right? Take Jose Maria Escriva, who's the founder of Opus Dei. There are videos of him online, these encuentros where they just pass the microphone around and people stand up and say, give me some spiritual advice on this topic. And he's a saint. I believe that, obviously people are flocking to him for advice. I think he does a great job of giving them advice as far as I can tell. But what he's doing is not what I would call the Ignatian way of discernment of spirits. The Ignatian way of discernment of spirits are typically a lot more pedestrian. They require a lot more time. They require patience. They require hard work. In some cases, require study, whether that's giving advice or even understanding yourself better to be able to follow your own good advice, even giving yourself good advice. The Ignatian way is that we're talking about here, at least, is a little bit less spontaneous, intuitive, those sorts of things. They require some thought. They require you to apply your intellect to what's going on for a real discernment of spirits. This is not to say anything bad about these other ways. Just the way that I'm talking about here requires work. All right, so today we will talk about uh, spiritual consolation and desolation. So I will begin by reading straight from the Spiritual Exercises of Saint Ignatius Loyola. So here's what he says about spiritual consolation. I call it consolation when an interior movement is aroused in the soul by which it is inflamed with the love of its Creator and Lord, and as a consequence can love no creature on the face of the earth for its own sake, but only in the Creator of them all. It is likewise consolation when one sheds tears that move to the love of God, whether it be because of sorrow for sins or because of the sufferings of Christ our Lord, or for any other reason that is immediately directed to the praise and service of God. Finally, I call consolation every increase of faith, hope, and love, and all interior joy that invites and attracts to what is heavenly and to the salvation of one's soul by filling it with peace and quiet in its Creator and Lord. That is spiritual consolation. Here is, according to Saint Ignatius, spiritual desolation. I call desolation what is entirely the opposite of what is described in the third rule, meaning the rule on spiritual consolation. Darkness of the soul, turmoil of spirit, inclination to what is low and earthly, restlessness rising from many disturbances and temptations which lead to want of faith, want of hope, want of love. The soul is wholly slothful, tepid, sad, and separated, as it were, from its Creator and Lord. For just as consolation is the opposite of desolation, so the thoughts that spring from consolation are the opposite of those that spring from desolation. That may not seem very, very complicated, but I think it's just a lot more tricky because we use these words consolation and desolation in our everyday conversations, and we don't always mean what St. Ignatius is talking about. So maybe one way to distinguish it is to call this spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation, right? Even that doesn't necessarily completely clarify everything, but these terms are referred to by St. Ignatius for the rest of the spiritual exercises. So we really do want to think about these and make sure that we understand what we are talking about. I think what we are talking about are those peaks and valleys in the spiritual life, not just your everyday feelings, not just your everyday sense of who you are and what you should be doing, but we are talking about those real peaks and valleys. And in those peaks and valleys, the center of what we are talking about are those feelings and their relationship to God. You have some people who may walk around feeling consoled in the regular sense of the word, and they say, "Yeah, everything's great. I have a job that I like a lot. I love my girlfriend, and things are going good. And so, what do I have to complain about?" But on the side, maybe I have my life a little bit compartmentalized, and there are parts of my life that I'm just sort of satisfied to be in, that I know are sinful. But hey, I'm not a saint, so no big deal. We're not going to worry about them too much. They're not so bad anyway. I'm basically avoiding all of the worst consequences that can come from doing bad things, so therefore it's not as big a deal. We're not talking about that is like an example of where you have feelings that might feel consoling, and you might even have some that might feel desolate or might make you lead to desolation if you think about them hard enough. But since you weren't thinking about them that hard, we're talking about not a real peak or not a real valley. Consolation and desolation, spiritual consolation, spiritual desolation are those high peaks and low valleys, not just peak and then back to the middle again, but a peak or way below what you might think is that kind of baseline feeling, especially regards to how you relate to God, right? They are not sure signs of knowing God's will. Just because you are at a peak of feeling good, feeling caught up in the Spirit, feeling all that does not necessarily mean that you automatically are going to know God's will. So be careful. It doesn't mean that. And then also to know that valley also is not always, that valley, that desolation is not always a clear sign that you are in the grips of the power of Satan, and you can't figure out what to do next. You can't trust anything that you think or feel in those moments. That's also not really true in any and all cases. Often consolations that we feel can be a way that Satan finds a way to somehow squeeze himself into even consolations, and find a way to pull you out of them. So be careful that you don't understand consolations and desolations as the obvious, straight access to knowing God's will and then having the power to carry out His will for you in your life. Consolation basically is spiritual consolation, is knowing that everything is gift and grace. And that kind of awareness of all of that. Awareness in a way that it's hard to carry out your day in a normal, usual way, right? Whenever you are really in spiritual consolation. Desolation is very similar to that, except the opposite, right? That you don't recognize God at work in your life, that you don't recognize grace. Everything feels like you are plodding along and you can't quite get it. And you're not aware of the way in which God is acting in your life, the way that you ought to be. That's what we're talking about with consolation and desolation. It might also be good to look at the ways in which we're talking about acts versus feelings versus other things, right? So for example, consolation. We can talk about consolation as a feeling. I'm feeling like I'm in consolation. I'm feeling my heart is lifted up, to God. I feel all the good feelings that I'm supposed to feel. And then I can also talk about consolations as the source of those consolations. So I can say, oh, I find a certain kind of Gregorian chant consoling, like it leads me to those feelings. So you have a consoling object that leads me to subjectively feel consoled in some kind of way. And then finally, there's like, to be in consolation could be referring to the ways in which you are acting according to those feelings. So, if I feel consoled by God, something has prompted that consolation in me from the outside. And then now I'm going to go and do great things for God, do things according to the way that God wants me to do them. That might be a good way to always be considering consolation. Desolation, really the very same way, in the opposite, where I have these feelings, I have these things that I could experience that might also be, make me feel desolate. And then I have actions that I do in response to that feeling of desolation that just kind of bring me down even more. And again, this isn't everything. The peaks and the valleys are not everything that there is to say about the spiritual life. In fact, there will be times, and I'll talk about it in the future, there will be times when God may even remove those consoling feelings for some greater good, to prompt you to act in some way that is more to God's greater glory, right? I do want to make a quick, to talk about this word peace. Saint Ignatius uses the word peace. Sometimes when we speak about peace, we mean the absence of turmoil, right? Sometimes when we speak about peace, we mean the absence of turmoil. We're saying that I don't feel shaken up inside, therefore that's peace. That's not the kind of peace necessarily that comes with consolation. I think the kind of peace that comes with consolation is this calm acceptance of God's will. It may be that God's will is for you to suffer. It may be that God's will is for you to take the hard road. It may be that God's will for you is to have experiences in this world that other people would laugh at you, that they would, think that you're crazy for thinking this is what you should be doing. It could be that God wants you to do those things, and that you on your side respond in a way that says, Lord, of course, I don't enjoy these bad, painful feelings, but I want to do your will. I'm always reminded of Jesus Christ in the garden before he is to suffer on the cross, where he himself is already going through great sufferings. And he says, to paraphrase, God, my Father, I didn't wake up this morning wanting to be crucified, but your will be done. I did wake up wanting to do your will. That is so important. That is I think the perfect spiritual state to be in, where we are peacefully accepting what it is that God has called us to. And then finally, another word on love, right? So, we use this word love all the time. We don't always have a very precise meaning for it. When we are talking about the kind of love that comes from spiritual consolation, we are talking about the kind of love that we do not love creatures for their own sake, creatures, things created in this world for their own sake. We love them because we find somehow in them, that the created things in this world, we find God in those things. And when we find God in those things, they lead us towards God. They lead us to a better response to God than we were maybe before we experienced those creatures in the world. That's the kind of love that Saint Ignatius, I believe, is meaning in his description of consolation, and conversely for desolation, when we find ourselves unable to recognize God in those things, unable to know that the good things that we're experiencing are coming from God, and unable to let those good things somehow point us back to God when we experience them. I think that real consolation is often tempered, or often kind of that peak is often kind of pulled back into, I hate to say reality, because I think being consoled can be very real, but can pull us back into something a little bit more usual by the recognition of evil in the world. If all we did was walk around in this world with something like the beatific vision, where we're just experiencing God all the time, we feel God's goodness, it's wonderful, we're raising our hands in praise, and this is just wonderful, we're feeling great about it, we might not always feel prompted to do good in the world. We might not always feel prompted to try to eliminate the sin in the world, whether that's personal sin or sin that's out there. We might not always feel like we are up to fight the good fight, because heck, we feel so good, right? We just feel so good. So sometimes recognizing sin in ourselves and recognizing sin in the world can take spiritual consolation and put it back at a level that gives us the ability to respond in the world the way that God is calling us to respond in the world. This isn't always bad. This isn't always like, oh no, I've lost my consolation. This is not always bad. It's often a way of God saying, okay, now go out and do good things, right? Go out and serve me in some kind of way. So I mentioned that, desolation is the contrary of consolation. All those good things that I'm saying about consolation can really be true in terms of desolation. A couple of things I want to say as well about this. One would be that there are real chemical imbalances that people deal with, real anxiety, real depression, those sorts of things. I am not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't pretend that I'm going to know more than what any doctor is ever going to tell you or anything like that. Um, be careful not to always assume that these two things are somehow wrapped up. Like, well, because I feel depressed, that's desolation. Not always, not always, certainly not always. Although I do think being in desolation can feel like depression. I think that being, tepid in the spirit and feeling like it's just hard to get up and find a reason to get up and carry on with your day. All that stuff can look a lot like desolation. It can be desolation as well. And those two things can be very much intertwined, linked. But it's not just simply this bad feeling that I'm feeling inside, and I'm saying I know I should be feeling better, but somehow I'm feeling bad right now. I would say that desolation is not when you know that you should be feeling better. Desolation is the sense of like, I'm having a hard time seeing God in creation, and I'm having a hard time feeling led back to God through creation, through the world that I'm living in. I'm having a hard time growing in faith and hope and love. When you have real, strong, deep, abiding faith, hope, and love, it's going to be consoling. If you are drawing the right conclusions, it's going to be consoling. How can hope not be consoling? When you see that light at the end of the tunnel and you say, my hope is in the Lord, my hope is in God who saves me. When you feel that hope itself becomes, in a sense, the grounding of faith. Like, our faith makes sense in light of that hope, right? If you don't know what I'm talking about, read Benedict XVI's encyclical Spe Salve. It's absolutely fantastic. And in some ways, it nearly conflates faith and hope, because our faith is in a God that we should be hoping in, and our hope is in a God that we place our faith in, that we respond in a faithful way to. And so when our faith and our hope and our loving actions are put into place, and we are seeing that all correctly, we are going to respond in a way that is going to feel in some kind of way consoling, right? We're going to find ourselves in a sense, a deep sense of abiding happiness. That's not always the same thing as perfect bliss and all those other things, but there is going to be a certain sense inside of us that God is with us and that we find ourselves growing closer to God. So this is a preview for some of the future things that are going to be said here, because there'll be a part 3, probably a part 4, maybe a part 5 of this talk about discernment of spirits. There are ways to react when you feel like you are in consolation. There are ways to react when you feel like you are in desolation. And St. Ignatius will make use of those words. So I hope that that terminology, well, now that we've thought about it, maybe kind of mold it over a little bit, is going to make a little bit more sense when we speak about those other things in the future. So I never ask anybody to like my videos or to subscribe or anything like that. But I do plan on making more of these videos that might explain things a little bit more clearly according to Saint Ignatius Loyola. If you want to sort of keep up with that sort of stuff, it'd be a good idea if you subscribed or at least look in the playlist that I've made on YouTube. I've seen a couple of comments in the YouTube channel, so I'm going to see if I can read those and maybe respond to them. Teresa says hello. Hi back to Teresa. Tom says, good afternoon, Father John. Good afternoon, Tom. God bless you. Jennifer Morgan. Were the references for consolation and desolation from Saint Ignatius available? Yes. So this is something you can look up online. It's coming from the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius Loyola. There are a number of translations that you can read. It's made available free from a lot of different sources. I'm reading from the Father Louis J. Poole, S.J., translation of them. Just a warning, this book, The Spiritual Exercises, and which you're going to find online, that PDF, is really sort of like, it's really a guide for spiritual directors to come to understand these things and then help other people by understanding these things. So this is not a book so much that you're just going to read it and then say, oh, I'm going to do the exercises out of this book. That's not how this is supposed to work. This is these are like, think of them as medicine. This book is a book about medicine to be read by somebody who is a practitioner of medicine in some kind of way to help other people. I would say that if you just pull the book off a shelf and you just read parts of it, some of it can be really ultimately misleading. I think when it comes to the discernment of spirits, though, it is possible to kind of like pull that part out and look at it, even if you are not a spiritual director, even if you just want to kind of understand some things, you can do that. These rules are sort of annotated, right? So they start with number 313 of the spiritual exercises. 313 according to Saint Ignatius Loyola. And then they have rules that start off, rule 1, rule 2. So rule 2, for example, is number 315, right? So 313 starts the rule for discernment of spirits. By the time you get to 315, you're on to rule 2, and then the description of the spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation are rules 316 and 317. So I hope that that's helpful. That's a well-used book, Father. Yes, Teresa, this is a well-used book. I have a number of different copies. This happens to be the copy that was nearest me at this time, but I have several copies that I keep laying around. A lot of them have little notes scribbled in everywhere. But it's really great. St. Ignatius put together these spiritual exercises really through most of his life, even before he was a priest, even before he founded the Jesuits. He took a lot of notes, things that he had been told by a lot of holy people, things that he experienced himself, different things he felt God put on his heart to write down and to put out. And very, very little of it is completely original. Most all of it is sort of like a summary of good Catholic spirituality that St. Ignatius, put together in the 1500s, first half of the 1500s. All right. Well, that will end the video. I thank you for watching. And like I said, subscribe if you want to see those other videos. I'm not looking for likes. I'm not looking for subscriptions. This is a side gig for me. I'm not out here to make any money. I don't have a Patreon. Go give $20 a month to other people who are very good. There's lots of people who are worthy of it. I don't miss any meals. I'm good to go. I appreciate you watching the video. Thank you very much.